Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to the stage, Michael Casey.
So, long before Bored Ape Yacht Club did its Other Side project, long before Sandbox, long before Decentraland, long before that company changed its name from Face something to Meta, whatever it was, all of that, the metaverse itself was conceived not by a Silicon Valley investor, not by a developer, but one of the greatest sci-fi authors of our time, Neal Stephenson. Okay, he's going to join us on stage with another visionary who foresaw the state of things in virtual reality long before anybody else. And he's known really as the founder of the field of virtual reality, and that's Jaron Lanier. He's a scientist, a musician, an author, and a really big, influential thinker in this space. This is going to be, I think, a fascinating conversation. And they will be moderated by my good friend Leah Callon-Butler, who is, I'm sure, going to just do a tremendous job here. So a round of applause for Leah, Neal Stephenson, and Jaron Lanier.
Thanks, Michael. All right. Or do you want to sit here? With Neal? Yeah, I think the two of you, you've got some great chemistry. We definitely want to roll with that.
Yeah. I'm always in the wrong place.
Not today. You're exactly where you need to be. Thank you so much for having us, everybody. My name's Leah Callon-Butler. I'm a director of Emfarsis. We are a Web3 investment and advisory firm that's focused on social impact. I'm also a CoinDesk columnist. I've mainly covered things like blockchain adoption across Southeast Asia, where I'm based. And that led to a mini documentary, which was called Play to Earn. You can find it on YouTube if you haven't checked it out yet. It was all about the rise of NFT gaming in the Philippines. Enough about me. Have you seen who we've got on the stage today? Thank you to Michael for an amazing introduction. I just wanted to add to that, though, because above and beyond your amazing bios, you're also longtime friends. And we actually had a prep call. They can't even remember where or how they met. They've been friends that long. I asked the question, is there anything that you disagree on? Because they do share many values and think very similarly in many ways. The only thing that we could come to is that there is something that is better to collect. If you're a collector of musical instruments or weapons, there is actually one that's better. Somebody won this argument.
Do you want to talk about the flute? I think we should bury the hatchet, as it were, by talking about the flute.
We're not burying a hatchet, we're burying a flute. Well, I would argue that usually when there's a new technology, it shows up as an instrument first. That we had to have musical bows before there were bows and arrows, logically. We definitely had bells before we had cannons. That's where cannons came from.
Casting technology.
The casting, right?
Yeah.
Silicon Valley started with Hewlett-Packard, and its first product was a music synthesizer for Walt Disney to use in Fantasia. And many other examples.
Where'd you get the bow thing? So you're saying that before you come up with the idea of shooting an arrow, you have to have made a bow?
Yeah, I think you could have had a spear before an arrow.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to claim the spear, although I don't know, like you can hit things and make noise. I don't really know. I wasn't there. Okay. Even though in the tech world, I sometimes feel old enough at this point that maybe I was.
Yeah.
So the story is, it turns out there's a whole tradition of flutes with hidden blades. And I have an 18th century busker's flute from Japan, from Edo, that if you're playing it and somebody's giving you trouble, you whip your hand really fast and there's a hidden blade and you're right there with the blade. And so I thought, here is reconciliation.
Yeah, yeah. And there's...
All right.
Okay. And we've learned something about
I'm so glad we settled that.
What it's like to be a street busker in...
Yeah, that did not come as news. I've been a street busker. I was like, when I saw that thing, I said, that's what we needed back there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would have helped. Yeah.
I'm glad we settled that. I really did want to know the outcome of it. So as you can see, they've been friends for a long time, so we're going to have a great conversation today. I love the way that you guys riff on each other, so please continue to do that. But let's dive right into the Metaverse VR questions. It's 30 years since Snow Crash was published, and I'm definitely getting a book signing at the end.
Happy to.
And so Jaron, you also fathered the term and the field of virtual reality, in the 80s. So, but how do you think about that today? I mean, there's been a lot of recent developments. There's that company, Meta. There's the rise of social media. Are you thinking differently about the metaverse and virtual reality and the way that you envision it than you did decades ago?
Sure, I'll start. I mean, just the two things that changed a lot since I wrote the book are that the rise of the game industry and the rise of social media, which I didn't see either of those coming. So, and just quickly, the difference that makes is that the way that 3D computer graphics became cheap and became a universal consumer good was because of the game industry. And so that is where the talent is, that's where the creativity is today. That's where all the people are who know how to make engaging experiences in a 3D world. I mean, I'm kind of glossing over a few details here, but broadly speaking, that's where we ended up. And then social media created a different economic model that I didn't see coming. It's an economic model that's a lot trickier and more complicated than anything I could have invented. The idea that you can harvest huge amounts of data from watching the way people click on icons and then somehow turn that into money is one of those too weird to be true things, but it is true. And so, I think what we see today is different from what's in the book, largely because of those two changes.
Thoughts, Jaron?
Well, I kind of feel like the social media business model was described in advance in two places. One is The Machine Stops by Emfarsis from 1907. Kind of has it. It doesn't quite nail it, but there's no other explanation for what's going on in that story, which is very similar to our current environment, I think, anyway.
Haven't read it.
Oh, you haven't read The Machine?
No.
Oh my gosh, you're in for a treat. It's 1907.
Wow.
E.M. Forster, the person who wrote like Remains of the Day and all of these novels that turned into the Merchant Ivory chick flick type of things. Should I call? Maybe I shouldn't have said that. Rewind. I said nothing. But and then the next place is 50s, which is Norbert Wiener's book, The Human Use of Human Beings. I think actually describes it kind of head on, but in a way that few people could read because it's all equations and stuff. And as far as surprises for me, I hate to say this, a lot of my surprises are disappointments. I'm a little surprised at how some things haven't gotten better that I thought would be better by now. But on the other hand,
Like what?
Oh, well, for instance, interaction. In the very, very earliest days of virtual reality, going back to, well, this is, I met somebody the other day who said, oh, I've been with virtual reality from the very, very, very beginning. And I'm like, oh, cool, when did you get into it? It said 2015. I'm like, okay, great, that's good. So obviously there was Ivan Sutherland before my work, and you can start at different points. But as far as having avatars and a shared world, that we did first, and that was 80s. And in that case, because the graphics were so horrible, better in Ivan's day when they did the very first prototype in '69. It was just stick figures. There was only lines. We had filled in polygons, which was so exciting. But we could only afford sometimes 20 of them in a scene in the very first virtual reality system. But anyway, the thing is, because the graphics was so terrible, the haptics were really good. So we had full hand and full body and a lot of really fluid stuff. I made like saxophones you could play in great detail with proper keys that were constrained and all kinds of things. And your fingers didn't intersect them. It was all kind of, we were just forced to. And then what happened is graphics started getting better, and so everybody was like, well, who cares about interaction? It's just virtual reality. And it never has come back. We still have like a lot of, there are people who track hands, a lot of the headsets track hands, but there's not a lot done with it, and most of the interactions could be done by game controller, going back to the game culture. And game controllers are just collections of buttons, and that to me is like really sad, because people, like, we're embodied. We have these amazing bodies and this incredible nervous system that's so adaptive and so fluid, and to be interacting with buttons in virtual reality just feels like a sin to me, honestly. So that is something I don't like. I love that you can go and buy a really nice headset for a few $100s. I don't like that you need to sign into Facebook to use it. That's stupid. That would be like, how would you like it if you had to sign into Facebook to use your money? Oh, wait. Anyway, I don't like it.
Noted. Yeah, I picked that up from some of your other talks as well. I mean, one of the things I love listening to you talk about, Jaron, actually both of you, is around that human connection and the real humanity of these worlds. So one of my pet peeves is that I always hear people when they're trying to make a distinction between the metaverse or virtual reality, and they say the real world when they mean the physical world. I was just wondering, how do you think, what are your thoughts on this? Do you think it's changing? Are our experiences in virtual worlds any less real than physical worlds? How do you think people are adopting this? Like, does this actually come back to the very nature of reality itself and the fact that, it's a difficult thing to grasp?
I think that a lot of what makes it real is the social element. So I think, I understand where people are coming from when they sort of draw that contrast between the imaginary things they see in a VR experience versus physical reality. The fact is that if you're on, let's say, a discussion group, a social media platform, and someone says something that makes you mad or hurts your feelings, you feel real emotions.
Yeah.
Yeah, and good emotions too. It's not all bad, just mostly. You cannot deny the fact that the feelings that you experience when you're interacting with people in a virtual setting are absolutely real, and that you can suffer psychological trauma, you can feel happiness, joy, you can meet people, you can fall in love. So I think that is a complicating factor in that sort of distinction.
Do you think it's changing? With things like COVID, for example, so many more people, they've been remote working, or perhaps they've escaped into virtual environments to get the kind of things that they missed when they were locked down at home. I mean, do you think people are gravitating more to virtual environments being real?
Way back in the day, part of what got me into virtual reality was this, I'd had a mentor when I was a kid, a teenager named Richard Feynman, who was this famous physicist who, when he was a kid, had worked on the Manhattan Project. And all the people from his generation were very haunted by that. Was it a good thing or not? At the time, it was a mandatory thing. And the question was, as technology gets better and cheaper, are we inevitably facing a moment when it's just too affordable to destroy everybody else and some kid does it? Is that going to happen? Or is there some other path that isn't total control? And that's a hard question. And I've always been interested in survivable paths that aren't total control. That's kind of like what I'm seeking, right? And so one of the ones I was really interested in is that you can't experience technology except through experience itself. So if you had a technology of experience, it might be even more intense than the technology that would otherwise generate an experience. And so maybe a technology of experience would be intense enough. Well, the way I used to put it is to distract humanity from mass suicide, but that was me at 17. So I don't think I'd use that language now, but I guess I just did. But the thing is, that notion of intensity of art as more interesting than power, as a way for humanity to survive, that was kind of like one of the original ideas. And so in that sense, having a culture of virtual reality where we think of it as real might actually enhance its power to help us survive. Of course, that could play out different ways. It's not that easy. There's a lot of different angles and tricky things here, but yeah.
I want to get into art more, though. Before we do, quick question, just a little definition task. So Neal termed it the metaverse. Jaron termed it virtual reality. William Gibson, author of Neuromancer, called it cyberspace. What is the difference?
Well, you sound like I saw your index finger go up, so I'm not going to... You go first.
Okay. The way I remember it is, all right, it all started with Suzanne Langer in the 40s, who's an art theorist who wrote about virtual worlds. Then Ivan Sutherland used that for his first headset prototype and talked about the virtual world. Virtual reality was supposed to be the social or multi-person version of that with avatars and everything. And then I met Bill Gibson, and he was making this super dark William Gibson, punky version of it. And I would argue with him, and I'd say, oh, you're going to ruin this beautiful, idealistic thing we're doing with all your darkness. Can't you make it not so dark? And he was saying, that's not the way writing works. I wish I could do the Tennessee accent. He said, I'll call it something else. And I think, and so then we had the dark version with cyberspace, which John Perry Barlow eventually redefined as anything that exists only online. And then the sort of, at that time, the bright hippie, version. And I always thought that what you were doing with the metaverse was making fun of both of us. It's like, oh, you're both ridiculous. And I thought that was great. I remember Bill and I both thought, yeah, we're both ridiculous. It's true. So.
Well, it's definitely, I mean, the Snow Crash is a little bit of a weird novel in the sense that it's both a dystopian novel and it's making fun of the genre of dystopian novels. So it's kind of having its cake and eating it too. The idea behind the metaverse, as opposed to, say, cyberspace, is that it's a consumer-oriented it's a mass medium. It's like, okay, if we had VR, if we had cyberspace, if we had the technological capability to make that, and it fell into the hands of television studios, the same people who make, The Price is Right or whatever, what would the result of that unholy marriage be? And so it's presented as something that is meant to appeal to the biggest possible audience, but it's also presented as a thing that can be beautiful. So it's not emphasized a lot in the book, but there's a couple of interludes where we go to Hero's house or Ing's house in the metaverse, and they're both exquisitely crafted works of art that these people have put a lot of time and effort into. It's the refuge that they go into and hang out in. And there is genuine artistic value in the architecture and the design and even the sonic environment that's described in that world. So hopefully we can have a little of both.
I do love the optimism that comes through from both of you, like in all of the chats that we've had. But I want to ask about, why do you think sci-fi is so dark? Why is there this sort of obsession with being dystopian? And I guess as a contrast, in the crypto space, we often see people thinking, crypto's going to save the world, wag me, we're all going to make it. Like there's this hyper utopian attitudes. Could you talk a little bit to that contradiction?
My theory is it all started with the toppled Statue of Liberty on the beach in Planet of the Apes. At the end of the movie, they see the Statue of Liberty, it's fallen over, it's got dirt on it, and it's a super powerful cinematic moment and super cheap, right? I mean, some genius figured out that if they made a model, or it might even be a matte painting of this toppled statue and kind of made it look shitty, that they could send an incredibly powerful message and not have to spend a lot of money. And that has been a constant ever since, where whenever somebody wants to imagine a future, I'm speaking specifically of film and television, then it's just easier and cheaper to take something we have now and throw dirt on it than it would be to design a coherent vision of a future that actually works. And so once I had that thought, I just see it everywhere now. It's just kind of so obvious to me. But I don't think, I believe you're correct in that the overall tone of literary science fiction and some screen entertainment is not necessarily all that dark. That's not actually how people, I think, normally think about the future.
Thoughts, Jaron? Did you want to add to that at all?
Oh, there's so many angles on that. This is something that concerns me a great deal because we're a technological civilization. We're in the process of rapid change, and yet we have almost no positive narratives that convey a future for our young people, and I just find that to be horrible. There have been some. I'm very fond of the 90s Star Treks as an example.
Yeah.
But they're rare. I'll share another theory about where it comes from. I think a lot of the successful creative people grew up in a sort of a comfortable environment because it was their parents who had to struggle, and then they got to go to a nice school and learn to be a writer or a director, and they're embarrassed about it. And so everybody's constantly afraid that they're uncool because they came from a nice suburban affluent
Right, so you have to
background.
show how hard you
So
work.
the only cool thing in the world is to be dark. And
Yeah.
if you're not dark, then you must be acquiescing
Right.
to this horrible, meaningless bourgeois, life. And I think that's an incredibly shallow and dysfunctional way of approaching things, but I think it still rules. So that's another one.
Yeah, I'll buy that.
Yeah. Wow. Applause.
Yeah.
How many of the people who clapped grew up in these bourgeois suburbs and feel embarrassed by it? All right.
All right, well, we've covered a lot of philosophical ideas, but there has been like a really big announcement this week. Neal, that you have announced that you're working on a new Layer 1 blockchain protocol. It's called Lamina 1. It's been designed with Web3 principles in mind. It's very focused on the creator economy, and it's meant to be looking at the original idea for the metaverse. So I'm just going to chuck it right out there. Why do we need another Layer 1? And what is your protocol solving that others aren't?
Yeah, so I mean, big picture is that people have been working on their versions of the metaverse for almost ever since the book came out, and it has put me in an interesting position. I don't want to sort of throw my authorial weight behind any one particular project that's being worked on because it seems unfair to all of the others. But it seems like a possible way to be useful is to help kind of lay down some of the economic infrastructure that would make it possible for all of those other people to build what they want to build and to extract value from it. So it kind of boils down to the question of what creates value in the digital world, and then how should people get rewarded if they have created value. And my emphasis tends to be on specifically on what I would call artists, and that to me is a very broad term that covers just anyone who's doing creative work, whether it be people we normally think of as artists, like somebody who paints textures or does animation in a virtual space, but people who create sonic environments and so on, and developers, people who create experiences. Just to sort of tee Jaron up here, there's another kind of value creation that he's been thinking and writing about quite a bit, which is So what you do when you're on social media kind of explains the fact that social media companies are rich. And so if you think about sort of what infrastructure needs to be in place to allow all of those different kinds of value creators to derive some actual benefit from the work that they're doing, and to do so in a decentralized way, then I think there's a strong argument that a new chain that's optimized for that purpose could be quite valuable and quite constructive.
Beautiful segue into the idea of value chains. So
right.
we talked about this. Do you want to explain
It's
a little bit, Jaron?
It's this other chain, not the blockchain, the value chain, could be united. So let me, and by the way, I just wanted to say, I really wish you the warmest, best luck with this.
Thank you.
I really do.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So, do you remember open source? It was a movement. You all remember that? Okay.
I think some here may have heard of it.
You might have encountered it. So one of the hallmarks of the open source movement is that if somebody does something, somebody else might use that thing to make something else. And in fact, over time, you might build up a tower that reaches ever higher to do more and more than any one person could have done, right? You're all familiar with that, right? That's a value chain. I like that. And so capitalism as we know it and markets as we know them were also built on that. That's what Adam Smith wrote about. That's, you know, and so there are various systems that do that. Now, in my opinion, the open source movement made an error in not admitting that we live in a society that is market-driven in many ways and demonetizing everything. I think that was actually an error. But anyway, that's what happened. Now, along comes Web3, and Web3 is saying, wait a second, we live in a market world. We can't make everything volunteer. That doesn't quite work. But there's this thing about, it's not precisely a technical problem, it's an emphasis problem. A lot of Web3 has been based on going back to square zero again and again and again. Like you invest in a coin, you invest in an NFT, and then that's it. And then you might gain money if somebody else wants to buy it for more than you paid for it. But is somebody else going to reuse it to build something else and have that thing make value and then have royalties or something trickle back up to you, or dividends, or whatever you want to call it? Is the value chain built in? Now, it could be, and there are a few projects like that. There's totally doable in the Ether ecosystem, in some others, and yet it's not emphasized, and yet, that's the only thing that makes civilization. That's what makes the world better. So it should be the most emphasized thing, just like it was in the open source movement. And so that's my little bugaboo here. I don't like going back to, like, a token by itself shouldn't actually be so valuable. It should be how it's used as other tokens build up on it. That is where we build civilization. That's where we build the future. So my plea to you is value chains out of the blockchain. Please, please. And Neal's project is doing that, not to plug it in particular, because you have to love all the different projects, like you were saying. Yeah. But the thing is, I really think the technology is present to do value chains. It's just the emphasis. And so the way you know there's a value chain is you earn more money from downstream uses than from the initial bet. Another way you know is that your ultimate customer is somebody using something built rather than somebody else who buys it from you. And you make more money from holding than from selling. That's another way you know. You know, so that's what we need to build.
So what are some use cases for this? I mean, when I think about it, I think of maybe a creator in something like the Sandbox, which is a blockchain-based virtual world. Maybe they're making some 3D voxel art that can be used in a game, or maybe if it's a creator that's creating some educational content that's going to help people onboard to crypto. And Neal, you mentioned some things earlier, which was about maybe it's even just clicking on a link or publishing a post or contributing to a forum. But what are some other use cases? Jaron, you mentioned something that I hadn't really thought about before in terms of AI and algorithms and around how we could actually be creating better inputs for those. So How does that fit into this whole idea of value chains?
Sure. Well, one of the amazing things in just the last year, this is very new, is that big AI models are starting to really work, right? And some of the famous ones are the GPT language models. I'm sure some of you have seen DALL-E, the image generation model, Codex, the code generating model, all from the same cluster of researchers, actually. And I applaud this. I think capability is a good thing. But here's the thing. So I have to be careful here. I'm here as an individual. I am not representing the organizations involved. But as it happens, I am in the middle of this stuff. And one of the issues with, say, DALL-E is the incredible amount of effort that goes into kind of moderating it. Because if it just regurgitates what's on the internet, just horrible, horrible stuff will come out. For instance, if you just enter the single word Asian, just porn comes out, which is not what you were talking about probably, you know? And so that's horrible. And so the thing is, if you try to fix something like that on the output side, it takes an infinite expense. But there's this other way, which is instead of saying all the input comes from anonymous people who just had data taken from them, what if we could unionize those people and they negotiate for money for their data based on the incremental improvement that they can demonstrate? In other words, it's not a handout, it has to be based on real work. And then you create economic motivation for people to make better data. And then every time there's some new robot, somebody will say, oh no, the robot's going to put me out of work. They're going to say, oh, this is great.
Yeah.
I'm an expert. I have an opportunity to improve the data going into that robot so it doesn't fuck up. That's the future I want to live in. That's what we call data dignity. That's a dignified future. Instead of saying everybody just has to live on welfare, we're saying, no, there's new jobs to improve the data. And by the way, I'd like that data to be on the value chain I was just talking about, where then somebody else builds up the data with an algorithm with another data, and then you have better and better stuff. This is a dignified future where people are justifiably proud of their roles. I like it.
What do you think, Neal? Is this the future of work? And are we going to use crypto to pay people to do this stuff?
I think we can. I mean, the fiat currencies exist, they work. We have payment systems for those. Cryptocurrencies are also a big part of the economy. Why not use those too? Particularly, if we can use things like smart contracts to help create structures that realize some of what Jaron's talking about in the way of value chains. So I've been collaborating pretty closely with a company called Neon in Seattle that's building a blockchain-based game called Shrapnel, and we've been working on a smart contract idea, sort of a template called Sigma that is intended, as a first crack at trying to solve some of these problems. And I mean, the gist of it is, and this is all early days, but if I write a book that's got a magic sword in it, and I would like to see that show up in a game or a virtual experience as a usable item, maybe I'm just a writer who has a good idea. I could put a thing on the chain that is a sort of napkin sketch of what the sword looks like and a few paragraphs of text describing it. And that's enough to kind of say, look, I invented this idea, but it's a far cry from being a usable game asset. A lot of work has to happen in order to get it to the point where it shows up in an experience and it works the way it's supposed to. So who's going to do that work, and why should they? Why should they put effort into doing that? And I think a lot of the hostility that I see on Twitter among game devs toward crypto bros is them getting the idea that the work that games devs do isn't appreciated or understood, like how much work it takes to achieve these things.
Absolutely.
So in this example, maybe that initial asset that's on the chain gets forked into an Unreal stub asset and a Unity one. And neither one of them is yet complete, is yet usable, but at least a lot of the work is done to put that idea into a form that could, say, show up on an asset store and be brought into a project, well, that's great, but it's still not a thing that you can use because, let's say it's an Unreal Engine, you have to create some blueprints, you have to change the way it looks so that it matches the art direction of the experience that you're making. You have to change the way it sounds. And so the people who do that work are very expert at what they do, and so it makes sense for them to get compensated for that effort. And so if this works, then eventually what you end up with is exactly a value chain that that has a sort of chain of provenance going back to the original writer who wrote about the magic sword. But as it advances, it gets to higher and higher levels of development, embodying the work that different people put into it, and all of them should get some share in the proceeds, kind of as they work their way back up.
That really does sound like the way to build these healthy, sustainable virtual economies that have real value and real reasons to participate. Would you agree, Jaron?
Yeah, and it's, if I imagine the future, I imagine algorithms continuing to evolve. So eventually there will be some big model that can adapt things to Unreal or Unity or whatever. But at that point, what should happen is people should also be able to migrate to ever higher levels of adding to the tower. I think that's a good thing. That's a good future. I also there's a funny thing where I think we have to avoid a creeping potential for sort of regurgitative conservatism in technology. And what I mean by that is people are buying, selling the same old tokens, and then AI models are working with the data that was already uploaded and doing more and more with it, instead of really fundamentally inventing. I really feel like this notion of being kind of stuck in a loop is something I really don't want us to do. But I sometimes feel like we're in danger of falling into that in the big picture, and there's really no need to.
I think you can feel it though when somebody in any medium comes up with something that is really new and really fresh. It's just like there's electric charge that you get out of it. It's like, holy shit, I'm seeing something I haven't seen before.
When was the last time you felt that?
Oh man, in music, there's a group called Brass Against the Machine, which is a brass band that plays covers of Rage and Tool. That I thought it was an absurd idea when I just heard about it, but when I started watching their videos, I'm like, oh my God, I never would have thought of this, but it's great.
I'll go listen to it this afternoon. I haven't heard that.
Yeah, it's, but I mean, it happened I'm reading a book called Spear by Nicola Griffith that came out a few months ago that is, again, it's just so startlingly fresh and cool and interesting. It's not a rare thing, I don't think, or it shouldn't be. Whereas, if you, so often if you go to, if you look at what's available in the way of new movies that are coming out, it does have that regurgitated feel that you're talking about. So I'm going to take the optimistic view and say that people who can break out of those regurgitative loops, that's a new term I coined, but based on the work of Jaron Lanier, that when people do shatter their way out of those and make something that is genuinely new, you feel it, you sense it. It creates this sudden inflection point in the culture that's incredibly powerful.
Yeah, it's a funny thing when you use codecs and you say, well, make me a website that does this or that with natural language, and it just pops out. What you know is that you're close to sort of the median activity of the species so far.
Yeah.
It's when you ask it to do something and it's like really hard, and you have to go through a lot of cycles. Yeah. Then you know that you're doing something a little different. God, I wonder if anybody's done coin with codecs. I haven't even thought about that. It must be. Anybody out here done codecs with coins? Oh yeah, all right. All right, well, that's the end of history right there, I guess. I don't know.
Talking about newness and inspiration for the future, we don't have much time left, but I'd love to end on some predictions because you both made some pretty wild predictions decades ago about what the world might be like today. What do you think it's going to be like in another 30 to 40 years if you had to make predictions about the metaverse, VR, maybe crypto? This is the time to take notes, by the way.
Every human being will spend 75% of their time entering long strings of letters and numbers to authenticate.
We're certainly headed that way. Yeah, I was trying to, yeah, don't get me started. I think like there's some value in not trying to predict, but to open doors for people who are trying to implement their own ideas. And so where I see my role now is in trying to create opportunities for people to try stuff, because what you learn over time is that the diversity of human thought and creative power comes up with things that a lot of them don't work, frankly, but some of them do, and some of them are transformative in ways that you might not have predicted. So I'm going to make an anti-prediction and say that the best way to see amazing things happen is to kind of open doors for other people to try things. Kind of a cop-out.
I couldn't agree more. Also, and I think in Web3, that opportunity for people to be able to participate in, say, like a global decentralized economy that they couldn't access before is very exciting. And it's also solving issues around things like talent pipelining and talent pools. If we can bring more people in to participate, the things that we could create and imagine is pretty insane, in my view.
Well, it's amazing to kind of see. I've had kind of a little bit of a vantage point on the game industry, and to see the globalization of that industry and the different kinds of talent that contribute to it. So you've got people all over the world right now, sitting in their home offices using Maya and Blender and other applications to create elements of components of games, and the globalization of that and the distributed nature of that is, I think, a new thing in the world. If we can find ways to keep that going and make it a economically viable profession, we're going to see amazing things in the coming years.
Well, and that's the thing too. I think technology is making it possible to reach people more than ever before. So those models have become a lot more viable. Did you want to add to that, Jaron?
Well, a specific example comes to mind. One thing we know is that a lot of kids have trouble learning math. It's very specific to each kid. And another thing we know is that certain kinds of visual and even haptic and motion-based presentations can cut through to a lot of kids. And there are other modalities that cut through to other kids, but there are only a handful of examples that are used to test, because every single one just takes forever to do, and there just aren't that many. And there's some nice YouTube videos, but even those are hard to do. And there's nothing comparable in interactive things. So if we have a combination of the value chain stuff I was talking about and the big model AI I was talking about, and a bit of positivity in the culture, we can imagine that in 40 years, every 12-year-old will be good at calculus. So that's my prediction.
Wow.
You're here.
Yeah, I'm loving the fusion too. I think traditionally education has been so siloed, but in these virtual environments with these new modes of delivery of education, we can definitely sort of mash different things together, where it's gaming and entertainment with calculus. I think that's going to be a lot more interesting than my maths classes were. Guys, this has been absolutely brilliant. I'm really grateful to have been able to have this conversation with you today. Thank you so much for coming to Consensus and talking to everyone in the crypto community.
Yep.